All right, everyone. Well, thank you and welcome to this webinar from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. I know a lot more folks are going to be joining in the coming minutes, but we've got a packed agenda, so let's get started. So welcome to MTF's webinar on the impact of higher education on Massachusetts and its economy. My name is Doug Howgate. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. So for those who don't know, MTF is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and our mission is focused on public policy issues that relate to the sustainable and equitable economic growth of our Commonwealth. And we view today's webinar as kind of a perfect illustration of that mission. What we do well is hopefully highlight issues of critical importance, we inform, and we bring together relevant experts to discuss not just challenges, but how we can work collectively to make things better. And this webinar is actually a part of a series that we launched last year called Massachusetts in a Time of Transition, where we're looking at a range of issues that are critical to Massachusetts' future success. The first of those issues we looked at last fall was on domestic migration in the United States and its impact on Massachusetts. And today we're going to look at what has historically and what needs to continue to be such a critical engine of the Commonwealth's economy, our higher education sector. So I want to start by thanking our sponsors for today's webinar, Point 32 Health, ML Strategies, the Mass Business Roundtable. We've been partnering with these folks on previous webinars and other events in the past, and we really thank them. Without their support, this event wouldn't be possible. And before I get started, I just want to explain to you kind of what you're going to see over the next hour. So the webinar has two components. We're going to start with a couple brief presentations, the first by me, the second by Evan Horowitz, the executive director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts, that's really hopefully going to lay the groundwork of kind of where things stand. I'm going to focus on demographics. Evan's going to take a little bit of a broader view on the economic impact of higher education and a couple other kind of key issues that seem to be facing the sector moving forward. And then we're going to use that as the jumping off point for what I think will be a great panel discussion. And we're incredibly lucky to be joined by our panelists that you'll see in a few minutes. Chris Gabrielli, the chair of the State's Board of Higher Education, Dr. Marisa Kelly, president of Suffolk University, Nate McKinnon, executive director of the Massachusetts Association of Community Colleges, and Grace Wong, president of WPI. So that panel will get started in a few minutes. But before we do that, we're going to kick it off with these presentations and just a couple of logistical notes before I get started. So we are recording this webinar, and we're going to make the recording available to folks, and we'll also share the slides from today with people. There is a Q&A function, so if you put questions in the Q&A, that's available for panelists, and then when we answer them, it's available for all attendees. But with that, I know we've got a lot to do, so let me get started, and I'm going to share my screen with our first brief presentation. So what we thought was important to start with, what is this idea of, we hear so much, and the Globe has obviously written quite a bit about demographics and higher education, knowing that higher education has been such a critical element of our long-term economic success, right? We're a highly educated state. We're a state that really sells itself on its workforce, and having such a stellar private and public higher education sector is really the foundation of that. So what are these demographic trends and what do they look like? I want to be mindful of time, and so what we're going to do is really just kind of do a quick survey. Quick hits, 2 or 3 slides on US demographics, what that looks like in Massachusetts, how we compare to other states, kind of where future projections are headed, the role of immigrants and international students in higher education. And then I also want to spend a couple minutes on minority serving institutions. We've been lucky to do some work with the Mass Business Roundtable to really look into these institutions, who they are in Massachusetts, and their role in diversifying our workforce. And so I want to highlight that for a second as well, and then I'll kick it over to Evan for his presentation. So starting with the US, and this is a theme I'm going to come back to several times, which is, I think if you were to boil down the synthesis of the demographic concern for higher education, it would become, we are going to have a smaller and smaller young population in this country, and that is an existential threat to higher education. And certainly there is truth to that. But going back and looking at the numbers, I think the story is much more nuanced than that. And one of the things that I think illustrates that nuance is this slide. So this shows you higher ed enrollment growth nationwide between 1952 to 2012, and it also compares it to US population growth. What do we see here? Absolutely, our young population boomed in the second half of the 20th century. But guess what? Higher ed enrollment grew at 16 times that rate, right? And this to me gets to the critical element of the policy ramifications of what we're talking about. there's not a whole lot we can do at a macro level about long-term population growth trends. There are some things, but a lot of that's outside of our control. But where higher education's strength really lay in the second half of last year was last century was making a compelling case to young people that their best opportunity for economic success lay in higher education. And when we see these numbers start to shift over the last decade, part of it is demographics, absolutely. But I think part of it gets to maybe a lessening of the strength of that argument of higher education, whether public or private, whether 2-year or 4-year, is where you need to go for a long-term economic future, right? So these are these same numbers over the last 10 years. And what do we see? US population under 20 already starting to decline, higher ed enrollment declining, but by slightly less. Now, in a second, you're going to see this chart from Massachusetts, and it looks a little different, right? So let's look at Massachusetts. And I want to start with kind of the same framing lens, which is, again, you look at a lot of the Globe coverage, you look at a lot of stories on Massachusetts higher education demographics, highlighting critical kind of demographic trends. But it's important to know, we have been dealing with a declining young population in Massachusetts for 50 years, right? Our under 20 population in 1970 was significantly higher than it is today. Now, we stabilized that decline in the 1990s, and so it's not that we've just been dealing with a slow and steady decline that entire time. But the reality is, both public and private, enrollment increased by 70% between 1970 and 2010, while our population under 20 declined by 22%. So this isn't to say that demographics don't matter, but what it is to say is there's an element of higher education's long-term success, which again is so critical to our economy, that is about not just the number of students, but kind of the batting average higher education has in convincing students that higher education is the place for them. And that's really where I think the long-term economic policy probably needs to go. All right, now this is the same chart we saw for the US, just for Massachusetts, 2010 to more recently. And obviously, this is a more negative picture. Our population decline has fallen faster, and more importantly, our higher ed enrollment has outpaced our population decline, right? This is not the picture we saw at the national level. So this indicates that we've got some challenges that we need to make sure we're addressing that might be a little unique to us. All right, so now let's look a little more closely at our higher education sector and what's happened over the last 10 years. And what we're going to start with is just a quick survey of, okay, we got public and private, we got 2-year, 4-year, and we've got undergrad and grad school. And what you see on the undergrad side of the ledger is consistently enrollment decline since 2012, but a couple different stories here, right? It's worse in the 2-year sector than it is in the 4-year sector, and it's worse in public than it is in private, right? The other thing to note, and this is as we think about how we make sure we continue to see a growing higher education sector, grad school enrollment continues to boom, right? This has been a real change in recent years as a lot of folks, and I think the pandemic in some ways helped this, a lot of folks consider how they can use higher education post a BA to boost their career, change a career, things like that. And this is something where Massachusetts has some really strong roots that we could build upon. Now let's look a little bit at those enrollment trends. This is 2-year enrollees as a share of total enrollment. And just two stories I want to kind of draw out a little bit here. One, 2-year higher ed enrollment tends to be a little countercyclical with the economy. During boom times, when there's lots of economic opportunity, historically, we've seen downward pressures on community college attendance. And that's probably what we're seeing here, say 2012 to 2018 or so. But normally during economic downturns, you actually see an uptick in 2-year enrollment as folks are kind of figuring out how to use the time when there may not be a ton of jobs to further themselves economically in the future. Pandemic didn't work that way, right? Even though it was a huge shock to the economy, one, you had a lot of people just, there was very little in-person attendance for a couple of years, which I don't think helped. And then two, we actually had a lot of jobs and wage growth was quite high. And so you didn't see that same kind of counter-cyclical rebound in 2-year institutions. And instead, you saw some of those numbers continue to decline. Now, the other thing that's of note over the last 10 years, and I will say some of these things that, fun with axes, we show the axes to kind of demonstrate the trend, but the trend is that our private higher ed enrollment as a share of total has grown by about 10%. And there's kind of two big trends here, right? One, public higher ed enrollment has fallen faster than private. And two, as I mentioned on the grad school side, this has really been a growth area for private higher education. And you see that, I think, borne out in these numbers. All right, so how are we different from other states, right? Isn't higher education important everywhere? And yes, it is important everywhere, but it is a different level of importance when you talk about the Massachusetts economy. And there's just kind of, I think, a couple things I want to talk about here. This to me, and I know Evan's going to talk about this a little bit as well, this to me is kind of the key slide. We have the highest share of our residents with a bachelor's degree or higher at close to 50%, about a third higher than the US in general, right? So what does this mean? It means, one, that when you think about how employers, how growing sectors view our economy, what they see is a labor force that is highly educated and ready to go into high wage sectors that are on the cutting edge of what we're doing, right? And you see that borne out in life sciences. You see that borne out in tech, financial services, kind of those other anchor elements of our economy that clearly have such a linkage to whether it's our undergrad or grad school system in Massachusetts. You also see, hopefully, and in long term, I think this has been true, this kind of virtuous cycle where we also have a population that values higher education, right? And so because we have so many residents who attended higher education, they also often send their children to higher education, right? And so for a long time, this was really this kind of a positive feedback loop that undergirded much of our economic success. What we also see in terms of what's different is the strength of our private higher education sector, right? So ignore New Hampshire here. The data here are true, but I think what we see in New Hampshire here is how some of the national data sets handle online enrollment. And New Hampshire, a couple schools in New Hampshire have done a phenomenal job with getting online enrollment. So let's ignore them as we're talking about for a second, as we're talking about just kind of in-person enrollment. Massachusetts stands apart from any other state in the nation in terms of its share of private higher ed enrollment, right? More than double national, significantly higher than the next state of Rhode Island, right? And this has also a couple of implications for our economy. One, I think this demonstrates that as we see these national pressures on private higher education, there's more at stake for us in Massachusetts than there is in their other states. And so as we think about policies, whether they be economic, tax, or others that have an impact on private higher education, we need to know that the consequences, both for good and for bad, are going to be more pronounced here than they are in other states. And when you think about those knock-on effects I just discussed, about what this means for other sectors of our economy, I think that's a really important consideration, especially for policymakers as well. And then as we also think about what makes us different in terms of how higher ed has been growing recently, grad school is a real area of strength here. So this is just nominal numbers. This is not on a percent basis. And what you see is Massachusetts punches way above its weight when it comes to grad school enrollment in the Commonwealth, right? We're behind states that are much larger than us. So as this continues to be an area of growth for higher ed enrollment, this is a competitive advantage for us compared to other states in terms of attracting students, right? All right. So we talked a little bit about what's happening demographically, the change in trend over the last 10 years nationally, what that looks like in the US, what our sector looks like. So now let's talk a little bit about where it looks like the numbers are headed. And here again, I think it's important to differentiate between the demographic numbers, but also what we're seeing in terms of what young college-age students want from schools, right? So here are the Moody's projections of population growth over the next 20 years nationally. And what do you see? You see that we're going to lose 5 million people under the age of 20 over the next 20 years, right? So that catchment area that higher education has typically relied upon, both 2-year and 4-year, is going to shrink. And guess what? Not surprisingly, it's probably going to shrink more in Massachusetts than it is in the US at large. Now, these numbers are not hugely different, right? And I think Massachusetts is better positioned here than some of our northeastern neighbors when it comes to our aging population, while aging is not quite as old as most of our neighbors. But the reality is the demographics challenges the US sees are going to be a little more pronounced here in Massachusetts. But to me, this is kind of the critical element in terms of what we can do about it, what it means for our policy future. This is a survey that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education does every year of high school seniors about what they're planning to do next, right? And we picked a year both for Massachusetts, that's the deep blue and the gold, and for Lawrence about where they plan to go. What do you see here? You see Massachusetts plans to attend higher education have declined by about 10 percentage points between 2016 and 2023, right? What you see for Lawrence is even more pronounced, right? And you also see that decline primarily in the 2-year sector. Now, why did I highlight Lawrence here in addition to Massachusetts? We're going to get to this a little bit with the MSI discussion and with the next stage. But the reason why is The growing segment of our population in Massachusetts is also the segment that has been most historically underrepresented, disconnected from higher education. These are our communities of color, low-income communities, communities like Lawrence. And so if we're going to kind of continue to maintain and grow our sector of higher education, especially and connect Massachusetts residents to the Massachusetts economy, what is happening in Lawrence is critically important. And so that's why we wanted to highlight here. And this to me gets to, I think, one of the things we're going to unpack a little bit during that panel discussion. All right, so let's also talk briefly about immigrants and international students, and then we'll do MSIs, and then I'll get to Evan. So this is looking at a Brookings analysis of census data of young population in the United States based on different immigration policy platforms, right? So that you see, again, that baseline 6% decline, which we talked about before. In a world in which we have a high immigration policy framework, that decline in the young population is cut in half. With a low immigration policy framework, the baseline decline increases by 50%. With zero immigration, the baseline decline more than doubles. This just indicates that again, as we think about what our future, honestly, for the Massachusetts economy, even outside of higher education, but especially for higher education, our ability to continue to attract folks from other countries to Massachusetts and then connect them to higher education and our economy is going to be one of the critical questions. And then as we think about kind of what has allowed Massachusetts economy to benefit so much from higher education, another thing in recent years where international immigration has really been the make weight to ensure that Massachusetts population continues to grow has been international attendance in higher education. We rank behind only California, New York in terms of the number of schools with 1,000 international students or more. The challenge is, and we'll talk about this a little bit, can we kind of rely on that continued growth? International student enrollment has doubled over the last 15 years. We saw a big dip during the pandemic, but I think I won't say more concern because the pandemic was pretty concerning, but I think another concern is a changing geopolitical climate, right? China is the #1 exporter of students to Massachusetts. As you think about changing world dynamics, what does that mean in our ability to rely on continuing to bring in international students who not only support higher ed, but then oftentimes stay here, maybe not for their entire lives, but for a couple years to really help our economy? All right, so I'm going to finish up with just a couple slides on minority serving institutions. And again, this is some work we did with the Mass Business Roundtable that we're continuing to do to highlight this federal designation that in Massachusetts relates to schools that have certain demographic profiles in terms of their Black enrollment, their Hispanic enrollment, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander enrollment. Those are the 3 categories we have. If you meet certain profiles, you receive this federal designation and you're eligible to apply for some certain federal grants. And the reason why I think it's such an important consideration as we think about our demographics and the connection to the economy is this is the Commonwealth's population change 2010 to 2012. White population down 330,000 people, Black and Hispanic population up 330,000 people. The reality is the growing sectors of our economy are also the sectors that have historically been most disconnected from higher education. So figuring out how we replicate schools that do a good job of connecting these students, not just to higher ed, but to the economy, has got to be job one for a lot of our economic policy going forward. And the good news is we have 12 MSIs in Massachusetts, and they're a mix of public and private. They're a mix of 2-year and 4-year. There's a bit of a geographic mix. And so this could be something that catalyzes some policy to coordinate strategies about how we serve growing communities and communities of color. And the reason why I think is pretty clearly articulated here. When you look at the diverse students educated at MSIs, minority serving institutions, it is more than the total number of diverse students at all other public higher education institutions, right? So when we're thinking about this critical need to connect communities of color to higher ed and to the economy, MSIs are a great launching point for that, and something that we're going to talk about a little more as well. So I know that was a lot, but I am going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. And then we're going to hand it over to Evan. And Evan, I think you're on mute.
All right, I was focused on getting my screen sharing set up, but now that I've done that, hopefully thumbs up from folks as you can see.
Thumbs up.
I'm going to pick up on a few things that Doug said and add a little bit of perspective to lead into the panel. First, just a little bit about the organization that I run, the Center for State Policy Analysis. So we do nonpartisan research on live legislative issues or policy issues in Massachusetts across a couple of domains. And the goal is sort of tripartite. One, to help lawmakers when they're working on initiatives. They have a critical lack of research capacity when it comes to understanding the impact of the laws that they are crafting and then voting on. And we try to provide some analysis of potential impact. Helping citizens understand the stakes of new laws and ballot initiatives. Ballot season is fast approaching. We'll be doing guides and analysis of all the coming ballot questions. And then helping advocates identify the most effective interventions. That is, we do some consulting work with groups who are looking for the best data on how they can make the biggest difference in the areas they care about. And we've done work across transit policy, education policy, tax policy, real estate, all over the place. We're talking about higher ed today. This slide here, which shows a 50-state comparison of total wages in higher ed as a share of total wages in the economy. You can see Massachusetts at 4.2%, way above the US average. And this is, first way to think about it, as an indication of how important this sector is to the Massachusetts economy, right? Vastly more important than the typical state. Second thing to say is 4.2% is a gross underestimate. This is direct wages. You have to work in a sector. It does not count things that we know are part of the higher ed economy, like if you set up a pizza shop at the corner of campus. That's part of the higher ed economy, and it's not showing up here. If you come to Massachusetts and decide to stay, come to a campus in Massachusetts, a university in Massachusetts, and decide to stay, you are part of the higher ed economy. You don't show up. If you're a company and you set up shop here because of the slide Doug showed about how many highly educated workers we have, you're not counted. But of course, you're part of the higher ed economy. So the way to think about this, I think, is the ratio here and not the actual numbers. It's a big part of the economy. And if it disappeared, if all higher ed institutions around the country disappeared tomorrow, Massachusetts would be hurt a lot more than most other states. And unlike a lot of economic phenomena in the state, this one is not just about Greater Boston, right? This is not, we see this sometimes when we look at regional patterns, all the activities in Greater Boston, and then maybe it sort of gradually peters out. No, what we're seeing here is region by region, the share of total economic activity that can be attributed to the higher ed sector. And you can see there is strong impact in Greater Boston, but then again in Worcester, and then again in Western Mass, presumably having to do with Amherst. Now, I should say this is a reflection of where people live, not where those jobs are, right? So what you're looking at is where people are taking their wages and going home, not where they're working. But you can see it's pretty broad across the state. So this is an important sector, not just in some areas, but in a number of areas. Having said that, the share of wages picture that we looked at has changed a lot over time, right? This sector grew relative to other sectors a lot between 2000 and 2008, so pretty dramatically in those years. It plateaued, it has since fallen off, which is another way of looking at some of the trends Doug was talking about. It's not just that there are enrollment challenges, it's not just that there are demographic challenges. These translate pretty directly into economic challenges. You can see here the higher ed sector is becoming less impactful as a driving force for Massachusetts economic growth. And at a high level, I want to talk about a couple of reasons for that. One, declining trust in higher ed. So this chart is showing the change in the percent of US adults who express having a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education over a couple of periods. And I really want you to look at the numbers on the right-hand side, because while there are some clear demographic differences in this declining trust between political parties, between age, there is not one demographic group in this breakdown that has either increased its confidence in higher education or sustained its confidence in higher education. There is uniform decline or unanimous decline, non-uniform, unanimous decline across all of these groups. And this is a huge challenge and an ongoing challenge. And the other thing to note here is that there doesn't seem to have been a pivotal event that shook everyone's confidence. The changes, this is hard to see, but if you spend some time, the changes between 2015 and 2018 are roughly symmetric to the changes between 2018 and 2023. So this is not just a 2020 pandemic event. This is not just, some 2016 event. This is an ongoing trend with some, let's say, potentially concerning consequences for a sector that has been so important to the state economy. And not the only thing, it's important to talk about AI here, because as a person who is on a college campus, right, that for me, this is not just an object of study. I inhabit a college campus. I depend on the dynamics of a particular college campus. And I can say it has been very surprising to me, the lack of sort of existential concern about AI, because I do think in some ways it represents an existential threat in the sense that it might end humanity as we know it. But setting that aside for the moment, an existential threat to higher ed. Some of the things that AI is good at are exactly the things that we have turned to higher ed to inculcate in human beings for decades. Writing, for instance. It is not a great writer, but it is a very good writer. And lots of composition teachers would be very happy to get their students to LLM levels of writing in a semester. And that really calls into question how much writing we need to teach. How important is this skill that we can now outsource very effectively to machines? Or take coding. Maybe no major has grown more than computer science in recent years, recent decades. And AIs are extremely good at programming, at computer management, in a way that makes it unclear how much we need humans for this. Maybe not this year, we still need them, but how much we will need them in 5 years, 10 years. And while I guess this can seem like a distant threat, I don't think it should seem like a distant threat, because the advances are coming weekly, daily. I should say this chart that I'm showing it's not exactly clear what I'm showing. This was a study of management consultants, and they gave them the opportunity to use AI or not, and they improved on their tasks, both speed and quality. And there are a bunch of studies like this now for management consultants, for doctors, for lawyers. The tools are really powerful. And right now, they are powerful in the way that they are helping people complete tasks, but pretty soon they will just be completing tasks for us. And specifically completing the kind of tasks that lots of higher education institutions have devoted themselves to teach human beings how to do. And this challenge is something that the whole sector is really going to have to understand and address if there's going to be a future for the sector. Last, more mundane, this comes back to something that Doug was talking about, which is the value of master's programs and graduate programs for universities. These have been extremely important, not just for getting new enrollment, but for raising money. They are very profitable programs. And they are also some of the first programs to decline when the economy is good. And what you're looking at here is first-time graduate enrollment by fields of study. And you can see declines in virtually every field. Math and computer science stands out. So again, you run right into the AI problem there, but declines everywhere. And ironically, this is, in part at least, a function of how strong the state and national, well, in this case, the national economy has been, in that it is the payoff of contributing money for a master's program when you can get a job is a lot lower than when you cannot. So in times of recession, these programs are very appealing. You can understand the investment as you wait for the cycle to work its way through the economy. But in good economic times, as we've been experiencing for years and seem to be continuing to experience in the coming future, it's much harder to justify paying significant dollars to higher education institutions for master's degrees that you may not need to get jobs. And this is a problem and will be an ongoing problem. That is as much as I have to say. I am really looking forward to this conversation and hearing some thoughts from the panel.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was great stuff as we expected. So appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to ask the panelists to turn on their camera and we'll get started with that panel discussion. And as I mentioned before, we are thrilled and very lucky to have the panel that we have, which we want to make sure is representative of public and private, Boston outside of Boston, and kind of brings us a variety of perspectives. And so I'll just go off the screen I have before me. So I'm going to introduce Nate McKinnon, the executive director from the Mass Association of Community Colleges, Dr. Grace Wong, the president of WPI, Dr. Marisa Kelly, the president of Suffolk, and Chris Gabrielli, who's the chair of the state's Board of Higher Education. So first of all, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. And there's a lot of things for us to dive into, but I think maybe to just tie hopefully a bit of a connective tissue between Evan's presentation and ours is, it was funny. I was having a conversation this morning about some of the questions and what we talk about. And it occurred to me that one of the things that sometimes goes unsaid is just all the questions we're going to talk about really have at their foundation just how critical higher education in all of its manifestations are to the state's economy, right? Whether it's the sectors we have access to, the people who come here, the vibrancy of our downtowns in many communities, higher education's at the center of that. And I think that's why it's so important. And so for me on the demographic side, the thing that really jumped out is certainly the numbers are in decline, but this question of kind of making the case, how colleges and universities need to make the case to students that higher education is the right place for them, for their economic future. And maybe I'll start with Dr. Kelly and Dr. Wong, and then I want to talk to Nate and Chris. From the perspective of Suffolk, from the perspective of WPI, maybe if you could just talk a little bit about, has making that case changed over time, and kind of what do your schools need to do to make sure that you're continuing to attract more students to higher education as a pathway to their economic future?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Doug, for that question. I think it certainly has changed over time. There were periods in recent history where colleges and universities at any level, public and private, didn't have to do a lot of recruiting, right? The growth trajectory was just there. And we're in a very different environment now. We have to be sure that we are clearly articulating to students, and in some cases, students and their families, the value proposition. Why come not only to, why pursue a college degree, and then as a subset of that, why come to Suffolk or WPI or fill in the blank of the institution? And that is actually, I think, a really good thing, because it helps us to do a better job of ensuring that we are engaging with students, prospective students and their families, in thinking through what are they really looking for out of that college experience, helping them to find the institution of best fit, given their specific goals.
Yeah. Well, Doug, thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you for organizing this very thought-provoking conversation. So technologies are moving really fast. We just talked about that. And for the higher ed to continue to be relevant and also resonate with our students, we absolutely need to meet the needs, provide the education and skills of the future. And that's why we absolutely need to stay at the forefront in terms of our degree programs. At WPI, we just launched our artificial intelligence and also financial technology programs. We need to continue to do so to make sure we provide the knowledge and skills that's at the leading edge. And second thing is, we need to help our students continuously open exciting career pathways. And this is just one of the indicators. So here at WPI, our class of 2023 graduating class at bachelor level, average starting salary was $81,000. At master level, $96,000. So that's one indicator that their knowledge and skills are relevant to today's jobs. But we also need to make sure we get them career ready. We can talk more about that. But overall, we need to be very much relevant to our students and their future.
Let me open that up to Chris and Nate as well. Nate, obviously you're speaking from a specific sector of public higher education. Chris, as a member of the board, you see kind of the spectrum there. Talk a little bit there as well about this idea of, we saw some of the enrollment changes, particularly pronounced on the public sector. Nate, particularly pronounced in 2-year. What does that imply in terms of, again, as I think President Kelly mentioned, this idea of how we're honing that value proposition to connect it to the state's economic growth and the individual's economic growth as well?
Chris, you want to go first, or?
Either way, Nate, I'm happy to. Sure. First of all, thanks, Doug and Evan. You those two presentations covered an amazing amount of waterfront and were really great data-rich presentations. And Evan had to close with AI. There's no official meeting allowed anymore if AI isn't said somewhere.
Exactly.
And President Wang threw in as well. I think a couple thoughts I want to share. Number one, I really appreciated that you looked at some of the direct effects of in the economy. And as you and I have discussed, Doug, I mean, I think it's really great to see mass taxpayers and others focusing on this, because this is the state most driven by higher ed. This is the most central piece of our state. It's our national, international reputation. For me personally, it's why I live in Massachusetts. I came here as part of college, and then chose to come here because biotech was where I was helping build companies, and this is the place to be for biotech. No research universities, no Moderna, et cetera. So it's really central to our state. It's also central to our vision of equity, of opportunity. Our state has a lot. We're actually number 2 in college attainment in our ability to raise our own students. We're number 1 in total college attainment because we attract people from other states. That's fine economically, works fine from biotech companies and many others to attract people. It does not meet our equitability goals to raise up our own folks to the opportunities here and elsewhere. And so that's a crucial question across all our system. And to me, the thing that has been a top priority for the Board of Higher Education with regard to public higher education, although we're also a state, as you pointed out, that has private higher education at the highest percentage, and we care about their success too, is how do we do a better job reaching populations, particularly low-income populations, often students of color or first generation, but I'll focus on the low-income aspect. That is the group that has dropped off. That is the reason we have some of the shifts, and we cannot accept the outcomes we've had. We have a 30-point difference in the state between the likelihood of you earning a college degree within 6 years of graduation if you're not low income or white or Asian than if you are low income or Black or Latino. 50% plus 20%. That's the gap in our state if you come out of our high schools. That should be completely unacceptable to all of us. The solution involves improved performance at our schools themselves, whose graduation rates have been consistently ticking up. But it also means a real revolution in how we present schools. So, for example, this Board of Higher Ed has helped lead the Early College Initiative here in Massachusetts, which has led to more than doubling the number of students who are under 18 in our schools, predominantly our community colleges, but also some private colleges and increasingly UMass as well, who's recently pledged to double their number of students in early college. Early college goes to students where they're at. The old college paradigm of waiting around to see who filled out FAFSA, assuming the federal government ever fixes that, and then where do they choose to go, is a tired paradigm if we really care about the outcomes for these students. Early college in Massachusetts is leading to 15 to 16 points higher rates of matriculation and persistence. 15 to 16 percentage points. That's huge. One of the largest education effects anywhere compared to well-matched controls. Because the students are now being guided into college, by the way, spending less money and having a shorter time to degree to boot. So we need to innovate that way. I think the community colleges have really shown how to innovate in the last year around pursuing, and I'm sure Matt and Nate will want to talk about this, the adult population. I saw Dr. Cook, president of Springfield Technical Community College, piped in the dialogue box about how many of the students at his schools are already over 25. To see the surge of people over 25 coming back through Mass Reconnect, through a clear message to all adults that they can come back, speaks to there are a lot of students we have yet to serve, adults and younger students. But that's going to mean changing college patterns, which is uncomfortable for colleges and often particularly uncomfortable for faculty. And so I want to call out just a fact. Administrators and leaders, and a number of them on this call, are very comfortable with this. Faculty need to play catch up, and we have to recognize that's just a crucial part of what they have to see as their role, as we got to educate the people who need and want it, not the people who just sort of show up at our door conveniently enough in September.
And I want to unpack a couple of those things, but Nate, give your perspective as well. The community college sector obviously is pretty varied. How are you making the case, and talk a little bit about your perspective on this?
Sure. Thanks, Doug, and thanks for having me. I agree with what the chairman said in many ways. And I think that, I had a boss once, former commissioner of education, who used to say that Massachusetts has 2 gross domestic products, brains and cranberries. And in cranberries, we've slipped to number 2 to Wisconsin. So all we really have is brains, and we're a knowledge economy, and that's what we do. And it's true. And we are the most educated state in the nation when you look at bachelor degree attainment. I would argue that's the best of a poor lot. And that really ought not to be where we strive to be. We ought to strive to be much higher than where we are right now. And so from our perspective, the good news is if you looked at the 2-year drop that you showed and fast forwarded another 2 years to 2023 fall and even 2024 spring, it would go way back up. We're not quite at pre-pandemic levels, but we have dramatically increased the community colleges this year. Why? Because we're focusing on not worrying necessarily about dividing up the pie of who was already going to college, but expanding the pie and going after all the individuals who are going nowhere. And for us, that's a real market that we think is important in Massachusetts, that you need some form of post-secondary education, with the bachelor's degree being the ultimate goal for many, if not most students. And we believe that we can do that. And so one of the things, as Chris mentioned, is that Mass Reconnect has really served our institutions incredibly well. This past fall, our institutions, the number of new students 25 and older versus the fall prior that walked onto community college campuses increased by 44.8%. It's working. It's a universally free, accessible program. And by the way, those students are far more likely to be students of color and far more likely to be low income. So they bring with them federal dollars too. We think that this is the absolute approach to go forward, is to really open the doors of community colleges as the access point to higher education, so that our students can complete associate's degrees and go on to a state university, UMass or Suffolk or WPI or any one of the other great private institutions in the state. That's what we're focused on right now, is ensuring that we be that access point.
So a lot of great things to unpack there. And I want to get back to the issues of cost and kind of the connectivity of different sectors. But one thing I want to talk to ask Dr. Kelly and Dr. Wong about, and then open it up again, is, the first one of these we did was on migration and domestic migration, which has been a negative for Massachusetts. And one of the things that has really helped Massachusetts to continue to grow its population is international immigration. And higher education is such a key element of that. It's not the only element, but it's such a key element of that. And one thing that I got me thinking, looking at some of the demographic data, is, gee, it seems like a lot of stuff has changed on the international front of the last few years, right? And just curious, from your perspective, kind of, one, what's different in terms of how you attract an international cohort of students versus domestic? And then two, what's your level of concern about, is this something that can continue to grow? Should it continue to grow? And how do you hedge against stuff that's beyond your control when you think about, and certainly not a pandemic necessarily, but even other factors that affect how international students are selecting where they want to spend their collegiate career?
Okay, I'll jump in. There was a lot to that question,
Sorry,
Doug,
yes.
so I'm trying to think about the best way in. International students, I think, are important to colleges and universities, private and public, and in Massachusetts without question. But they're also very important to the economy, broadly speaking. If you look nationally, right, and think about labor needs, as we move forward as a country, without immigration, to some of the data you shared, we're going to have a very challenging time as a country just having our workforce needs met. So I think that is something that we all need to embrace, and to continue to be focused on recruiting international students who come to our colleges and universities in Massachusetts, and who often through OPT or other programs stay here and help become part of the productive, vibrant economy that we all want and that we've been talking about. So it's really critical. We have at Suffolk for quite a long time had a very high percentage of international students. That shifted a lot during the pandemic, as it did for many places, and we've started to see that come back up now. I think one of the things that is really helpful from a public policy perspective is a commitment by the federal government to try to continue to have pathways for student visas be much smoother than they were during the pandemic. They still are not as smooth as they once were. but also for us to continue to focus on diversifying the regions globally from which we're recruiting, because one of the things we really are vulnerable to, again, at all institutions, are the various political and geopolitical events that can be so disruptive, not only to the ability to recruit students, but also their desire to come here. And so as an institution, for us, diversifying the breadth of our global recruitment is really critical. And then if I may, just one more important point, I think as we look at how we educate students of any age here on the domestic front, for us, that engagement between the domestic students and the international students is really a critical part of their educational experience as well. And I think it is really enriching in so many ways, some of which that can be duplicated in other settings. But there's nothing like working on a group project focused on a major issue with people from around the globe in a hands-on way to help you understand the perspectives of other people, to really develop those skills of intercultural competence that are so important, I think, to to the life trajectories of these individuals and to our economy. So it's really critical, and again, something that I think all of us in the sector are focused on.
Yeah, that's very well said, President Kelly. I just want to add a few points here. The international students coming to Massachusetts is a very important part of our economy. At the same time, for our students to have this global cultural exposure is also important. It goes without saying that we are in a global economy, and a lot of challenges we are facing as a society are global challenges. And at WPI, we have students coming from 89 different countries, and clearly very global culture. And also we have over 50 global project centers across 6 continents. And so it goes both ways. We send our students overseas. We also attract a lot of international students here. And we also start seeing the coming back of the international enrollment after the pandemic. And clearly after pandemic, what has been changing is international students are more and more sensitive to the safety and the security of the community. And also they're paying more attention to the community, how they are, when they arrive on our campus, how they're going to fit in, also arrive at our city, what kind of cultural diversity we have. Like here in Worcester, we have the cuisine, the food, the architecture, the history. I think that kind of cultural diversity is important for students to feel more at home and they can settle in quickly. And President Kelly already mentioned that, and I want to emphasize that also about the career pathways. Same thing, if we want international talent to stay here and contribute to our economy, we have to remove the barriers and help them to have the career pathways. And that's important for us to work together as a community.
And for me, I want to send this to you, Nate and Chris, but kind of when we think about the policy to-do list on this, I think we heard from both Evan and myself this idea of making sure we understand exactly how important higher ed is, and then this idea that we think about federal immigration policy on a number of spectrums, but this is not one that hopefully there's some pretty bipartisan support for that shouldn't be forgotten. Yeah. But Nate and Chris, talk a little bit about especially the community college sector, but all elements of public higher education. A lot of first-generation Americans, a lot of immigrant students who are attending there. And that, as we saw in that Lawrence data, we're seeing a difference in terms of how some of those communities are viewing. Chris touched on this in his initial answer. Talk a little bit about that connection to international students and immigrants here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Doug. And I think that, I want to make sure that for all our viewers today, when we think of international students, I think a lot of us think about what we might have had at a 4-year institution, which is a F1 visa student who is here through the immigration processes legally to be a student. And they came here for that purpose. And they attend great institutions like WPI in Suffolk and our 4-year institutions. And we have some at our community colleges who come to us for that purpose as well. And that is a really important part of our economy and will continue to be so. What has become dramatically more important and urgent is our new arrivals who are not here for the purpose of becoming students at a Massachusetts institution of higher education, and yet are here. And they're right now living in shelters, and they're living in hotels that have been turned into shelters, and they're trying to find ways to integrate into our communities. Community colleges, as a reminder, do not have an off switch for admissions by design. We take everybody who comes to us. The only requirement is that you have a high school diploma or an equivalency. And if you remember back in the recession, we were bursting at the seams in community colleges and parking cars on tennis courts and doing midnight classes. It would be a great thing if we could be back to that spot because of our new arrivals and ensuring that they have access to higher education, starting at a community college and then continuing on to a four-year institution, and gaining the skills necessary to meet the high demands of employers. We think that's really important. And we also have English as a second language barriers that have to be accounted for as part of that at the same time. So right now, our institutions, thankfully, we got tuition equity over the finish line last year in the state budget. So now if you at least went to a Massachusetts high school for 3 years, regardless of your immigration status, you can get in-state tuition. That's a win. We have more work to do, and you can get state financial aid. So to me, I think, I don't want to lose sight of in the conversation about international students, how much it's shifted from those that we attract here to come to college, and now those who are here that we need to convince to go to college.
Yeah, I would say, we look at our top responsibility at the Board of Higher Ed, at least with regard to public higher ed, to be focused on, students who are here, including, as Nate said, recent arrivals. I mean, the state is putting $2 billion a year into our public higher education system, subsidizing it. And the purpose is primarily to serve people from Massachusetts, which is not to say it's bad when students come from elsewhere. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that's not our biggest issue. Our biggest issue is to convince students, as your data shows, Doug, that this is a good idea. And I think there's two big issues there. Number one, they have to believe it's affordable. It is a big problem that higher ed across the board has grown continuously higher than inflation. And I still don't see enough of a focus on that question. But one thing we can take action on, and I'm very grateful to the legislature, to the voters for the Fair Share Act and the groups that, work to get that to happen. I know that was a point of controversy with MTF listeners, right? But one of the most important uses of proceeds, and I'm someone who pays the millionaire's tax personally, happy to say, nice problem to have, is the reuse of it in order to make college much more broadly affordable. The largest investment made in higher ed from the Fair Share Act was $80+ million that has allowed us to make a guarantee to students in the state that no matter which public college you go to, 2-year, 4-year, flagship, local community college, anything in between, if you are Pell eligible, meaning your family makes $73,000 or less, you pay no tuition or fees at any of those campuses. We have not gotten that message out. It is a wonderful use of fair share money. It makes that part of my fair share tax I'm happy to pay. And it's great for students to know that, because they're afraid. They hear about $100,000 at Vanderbilt and they don't realize that it's really got no relevance to state universities or community colleges. And we are splitting 50-50 the direct cost to families between $73,000 and $100,000 of family income, which is over the median income in the state. That is a big deal. It's very important we communicate that. We've only begun to do that. We're envious of what a great job Nate and the community colleges have done on Reconnect, and we need to do that on this because this is really an important part of making people believe it. Second thing we need to do a lot more on is we've got to make our outcomes more, we got to ensure that our outcomes lead to good jobs. There's a recent study out that shows 52% of college graduates are underemployed, meaning they take jobs that you don't need a college degree for afterwards. That's not skills-based hiring working. That's college programs not really leading people to the jobs they need. That's a really crucial piece. And I believe some of the downturn that Evan shows, some of that's political. It's more with Republicans, than Democrats. It's more with older people than younger people. But some of it is people not so sure that college is actually preparing people for actual jobs versus for things that college faculty like to teach about. And so I love college faculty. I is one at Harvard. So, I think it's really crucial we really reinvent higher ed far more with far more relevance. An example, at UMass Lowell, it's the only college in Massachusetts now growing a co-op program, which means that 500 students at UMass Lowell spend 6 months full-time employed by an employer partner, paid by that employer partner, typically $20,000 for that period of time, and then come back and continue their classes. Those students are 50% or more likely to get a job offer from their partner. They have a recommendation from an actual manager. They don't just say, I took some courses that are relevant. I think we should see that at a lot more of our colleges. Sure. I think it's a great program. I think it also makes employers more aware of all the talent we're growing in Massachusetts that might be right next door, but they never noticed it.
So I want to build on that, and Dr. Kelly and Dr. Wong, as we get close to time, and thank you all for joining us. And I know there's any number of topics we could explore, but maybe we can just close out. Hey, if any kind of thoughts we haven't covered about certainly the role of higher education in the economy, but I specifically want to talk again about this idea of the investment, right? In terms of students, convincing students that higher education is right for them. That's obviously of what they're going to get from it. And also it gets to the cost issue that Chris talked about. And so I wonder if Dr. Kelly, Dr. Wong, talk a little bit about kind of that value proposition, also keeping in mind these perceptions and realities in terms of the cost element there as well.
There's so much that we could say about that. It's such an important topic. So I'll just make a couple of points. I think, first of all, it's absolutely critical that we better tell the story of the outcomes, the value proposition of higher education at all the levels we're talking about better than we have. It's clearly, if you look at those numbers about people's views of higher education, that we're not telling that well enough. And I think that, that's on us to do that. But it's also important to focus on, yes, that first job, but also not just a job, but a career path. You hear people who are questioning the value of higher education and people reducing degree requirements for jobs. And, that's fine. But they're focusing those arguments usually on a population they predetermine is not going to be well suited for a long-term, enriching, progressive career path. And I think actually that's creating or has the risk of creating another form of structural racism and barrier to first-generation college students and students from diverse backgrounds. So I really think we need to change the narrative around that. But just to give you the one data point from Suffolk, we have about 98% of our last year's class graduated, had a job within 6 months. And you can say, okay, robust economy, so that's not saying much. But of those, 83% of that said that job was directly related to their immediate and long-term professional goals. That's something that we've actually seen jump significantly in double digits over the last 5 or 6 years. In other words, when you can trace the experience in college directly to not just that first job, but to the intended career path that these graduates are focused on, that's a great thing. It's great for those students, and it is great for the Massachusetts economy. And we need to continue to be sure that we are articulating that message, because it's getting lost.
And President Wong, we're at time, but I want to give you the last word on this in your perspective from WPI, which is a unique school.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with what President Kelly has said. I think we need to not only get our students job ready, but also career ready, and not only career ready, but also career resilient. We talk about the things are changing, and absolutely the industry will continue to shift. The nature of the jobs will continue to shift. The thing is, we need to teach our students how to learn, how to communicate, how to be a team player, how to solve problems, and how to lead. And that's why at WPI we use project-based learning to make sure that we systematically prepare our students for these essential skills. And that's why it's not only about teaching students knowledge, important. I'll also get our students to have the leading edge skills with the technologies, also important. But most importantly, teach our students to be great team players, great leaders, great communicators. And that's what will get them ready for the future.
Well, I want to thank all of you, Nate, President Wong, President Kelly, Chris for joining. I want to thank all the attendees. There's a lot of ground to cover. Next time, maybe we won't go with 2 presentations, but ahead of time, maybe we'll combine them into one. But thank you so much. I hope everyone learned a lot, and we'll see you for the next one of these later in the year. So thank you very much.